Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live a lifetime carrying a secret I could never say out loud? I woke up every day, wore the right clothes, smiled in front of the right people, maintained the posture everyone expected of me, and at the same time I felt a flame inside that insisted on extinguishing because I could never find air to breathe. Mine is not just a story about being gay. It's about living decades in silence, about denying myself to fit into molds imposed on me by society, family, and religion. It's about transforming desire into shadow, love into lies, and identity itself into a daily rehearsed play. How many men do you know who have lived this way? Or rather, how many of you watching now have carried, or still carry, this weight on your chest? The lie starts small. A look I hide, a word I swallow before leaving, a quick response when someone asks about girlfriends. I'm in no rush. And so, with every gesture, I build a wall. The world sees a man who fulfills his role. Devoted son, exemplary husband, upstanding professional. But behind this persona, I exist, locked in silence, unknown to anyone. This is the price of living in a society that demands iron masculinity, mandatory heterosexuality, and well-rehearsed smiles at family dinners. Deep down, what I feel is that I have no right to exist as I truly am. The secret becomes a prison. How many dreams fall by the wayside when I have to hide who I am? The young man I was who longed to hold a friend's hand in school but never dared. The adult who made up stories to explain why he wasn't interested in certain women. The husband who entered a marriage not out of true love, but out of fear of being discovered. My entire life becomes a rehearsed script, in which the audience applauds the actor without ever knowing who the real man is behind the mask. This is what I need to talk about the silence that corrodes more than any external prejudice, because rejection from the world hurts, but self-rejection destroys. Think about how my body reacts to this kind of double life. My heart races when someone asks an innocent question. So, when are you bringing a girlfriend? My stomach churns when the possibility of being seen somewhere unexpected arises. My mind creates excuses, quick lies, alternative routes. It's like living in a constant state of alert, as if every gesture were a trap that might reveal too much. Desire becomes a ghost. It appears at night, in dreams, in secret memories, but disappears at dawn. And yet it remains there, pulsing, begging for space, reminding me every day that there's no point in extinguishing the flame. It will burn silently until it consumes me from within. How many of us today, at 50, 60, or 70, can look back and say, I lived the life I truly wanted. I realized too late that I lived for others. To please my strict father, to not disappoint my religious mother, to keep my family name intact, to avoid judgmental glances. But what about my own gaze in the mirror? What about the truth that never found a voice? The price is high. Superficial relationships, cold marriages, long nights where my pillow is my only confidant. Living decades like this isn't just denying desire, it's denying myself. And the cruelest thing is that on the outside, everything seems normal. Family photos in frames, trips with practiced smiles, birthday dinners with speeches about responsibility and honor. Those who see from the outside believe but I inside know. Every forced smile is a slow stab. Every celebration is a reminder of what I could never say. The world sees a fulfilled man. My heart sees an incomplete man. This is the wound that spans generations, and that many carry until the end of their lives without ever healing. Now think about yourself, the person watching this video. How many times have you swallowed your words to avoid revealing too much? How many times have you laughed at homophobic jokes to avoid arousing suspicion? How many times have you looked in the mirror and wondered what life would have been like if you'd had the courage back then to choose a different path? This isn't an easy question, but it needs to be asked, because living in hiding has a price, and it always comes. The body takes its toll, the mind takes its toll, the heart takes its toll. And as age advances, what remains isn't just regret. It's the feeling of having lived an entire lie. You might be wondering, why would anyone do this? Why would I live like this for so long? The answer is simple and brutal. Fear. Fear of losing my family. Fear of losing my job. Fear of being attacked on the street. Fear of disappointing my parents. Fear shapes every decision, every silence, every averted glance. But along with fear comes the secret hope that one day, somewhere, it will be possible to breathe without masks. It's this thread of hope that has kept me alive, even amid decades of lies. And it is precisely at this point that the story you're about to follow begins to unfold. I, like so many others, hid my desire for decades. I built a life of appearances, sustained by silence and excuses. I paid a high price for not allowing myself to live my own truth, and now, looking back, I must face what I truly lost along the way. This is not a distant story. It could be the story of someone you know. It could be your story. The first desire always arrives unexpectedly. It's unplanned, unrehearsed, and doesn't come with an instruction manual. It arises in small gestures, in the sparkle of a glance that lingers longer than it should, in the proximity of skin that shivers even before the touch. For those who lived hidden for decades, like me, this desire arose in youth, but was silenced before it could blossom. And the memory of that silence is what hurts the most, because it's not just a lost opportunity, but an entire life that could have followed a different path. It's as if a piece of my soul was trapped back, there frozen in time, waiting for the chance to finally breathe. In the story I'm telling, this moment happened on a simple afternoon, at school, when the streets still smelled of dust and the heat clung to the walls. I was 17, my uniform wrinkled, and I carried on my shoulders the weight of a world that brooked no mistakes. Beside me walked that friend, who seemed to light up the places he passed. His easy laugh, his confident walk, the way he spoke without fear of being overheard. While I hid in silence, he seemed to dominate the space. But it was precisely in this contrast that something began to blossom, a feeling that blended admiration, desire, and the dangerous hope of being reciprocated. On that particular day, we left the group and sat alone on a bench in a nearly empty square. He talked about dreams, plans, the future. I listened, but didn't pay attention to the words. My heart beat wildly, because what really mattered wasn't the speech, but the sound of his voice, the closeness of his shoulder, the warmth that seemed to emanate from every movement. It was as if everything else had disappeared, and in the silence between one sentence and the next, the temptation arose to say what had been kept inside. I like you, not just as a friend. But the sentence died before it could even be born. Fear spoke louder. Fear always speaks louder. This is my dilemma, and perhaps that of many men watching now. I remember the first desire I never experienced, that time when my heart raced and my body called for courage, but my mind built walls of prohibition. I kept this secret for so long that it became a forbidden memory. If this memory still hurts you, if you also feel like you lost something back then, write in the comments. Saying this may seem like little, but it's a way to release at least part of what was bottled up in silence. Returning to that scene, my friend didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but pretended not to. He just laughed, told another random story, and lightly slapped my arm, as if to make his presence known without saying anything else. That touch, however innocent, ignited something inside. It was as if my body screamed for a response, yet at the same time froze at the threat of discovery. I took a deep breath, feigned normalcy, and swallowed my desire. It was in that moment that I learned the art of denial, smiling on the outside and suffocating on the inside. And this pattern would follow me for years, entire decades, shaping my life, according to others' expectations, while I carried a hunger that was never satisfied. The following nights were marked by insomnia. I would lie in bed, close my eyes, and relive that moment when I almost spoke, when I almost let my heart take over. I imagined what it would have been like if I had taken the risk, perhaps a quick kiss, perhaps a brutal rejection, perhaps a shared secret that would change everything. But since I would never know the answer, only fantasy remained, and fantasy became a prison. The unfulfilled desire became a shadow following me everywhere, and the more time passed, the harder it became to live with this ghost. Today I understand. The first unfulfilled desire is not just a youthful memory. It is the root of a lifetime built on fear. It was the point where the road divided. If I had had courage, perhaps my story would have been different. Perhaps I would have found love, companionship, freedom. But by choosing silence, I entered a long road made of disguises, forced marriages, and practiced smiles. Every time I remember that park bench, that simple touch, I feel my heart still remember what could have been. And that could weighs more heavily than any reality. Many men who live in hiding know exactly what I'm talking about. They know what it's like to hoard secrets, fall in love in silence, pretend nothing is happening while their hearts race. It's a wound that never heals. And I want you, who are listening now, to join me. Comment below using the word truth if you've ever experienced a love you never had the courage to confess. This simple gesture can create a wave of recognition among us all, showing that no one is alone in this experience. Returning to my story, that first unfulfilled desire didn't disappear. On the contrary, it grew even stronger as the years passed. My friend moved on with his life, perhaps never imagining what was really happening, and I moved on too, but carrying within me the weight of a secret that would shape all my future choices. Every date, every relationship, every word spoken to family bore the mark of what was never said that afternoon. It was as if my entire life were an unfolding of that moment when fear overcame courage. And here's the cruelest part. This kind of memory doesn't age. It doesn't matter if it's been 20, 30, or 40 years. The heart still holds that moment as if it happened yesterday. That's why so many mature men still carry a lost look in their eyes when they talk about the past. Because it's not just nostalgia. It's the memory of a life that could have been different. It's the wound of a desire that never found space to exist. And it is at this point that my story deepens. Because it's not just an isolated scene from my youth. That unfulfilled desire is the key that explains the lie that came later. The marriage that served as a facade. The years of silence that consumed my body and mind. It all began in that moment when courage failed. And that's exactly where I need to continue, because the weight of that silence takes its toll, sooner or later. After that first unfulfilled desire, my life continued as if nothing had happened. But the truth is, everything was tainted by silence. What wasn't said in that square, in that friendly touch that hid a whirlwind of feelings, became a deep hole that I needed to fill somehow. And it was into this void that marriage entered, not as a gesture of true love, but as a survival strategy. A marriage, built not on passion but on fear, not on desire but on the need to appear like everyone else. For me, marriage served as armor. It was the uniform that fooled my family, calmed my parents, and satisfied society. It was the automatic answer to inconvenient questions. When are you going to get a girlfriend? It's time to get married and have kids. I met a good, simple woman who believed in stability and a future. It wasn't difficult to get carried away by the routine. Family dinners, Sunday, outings, superficial conversations about children and plans. On the outside, everything seemed perfect. But on the inside, every gesture was a reminder that this wasn't a choice. It was an escape. On our wedding night, silence spoke louder than any words. She smiled expectantly while I struggled to play a role that was never mine. My body partially obeyed, but my mind was elsewhere. Desire wasn't directed at my wife, but at the memory of that childhood friend, of that first glance that never materialized. With every touch, every kiss, there was an absence impossible to ignore. It's hard to admit, but this is the portrait of many marriages that never should have happened. Rings placed to hide, not to unite. The years passed, and my acting skills improved. I learned to smile in photos, to carry my son in my arms, to give thank you speeches at family birthdays. I learned to say, "I love you," without really feeling it. I even learned to lie in bed next to my wife and pretend everything was fine, when in reality my heart was beating in a different rhythm. But my body takes its toll. My mind takes its toll. The emptiness grows, because no one can live forever denying their own truth without paying a high price. And that price manifests itself in the form of insomnia, anxiety attacks, illnesses that medicine can't explain, but which the soul understands. How many of you watching now have experienced this feeling of being in the right place for others, but in the wrong place for yourself? Of fulfilling the social script perfectly, but feeling like your own life is slipping through your fingers? This is more common than it seems. Marriage in these cases is like a beautiful house on the outside, but with invisible cracks on the inside. Eventually, the walls start to crumble, and that's exactly what happened to me. The arguments started small. Complaints about my absence, my coldness, my lack of enthusiasm. She sensed, even without knowing it, that something was wrong. She'd ask me, "Are you happy with me?" And I'd respond with a fake smile, "Of course I am." But the look in my eyes betrayed otherwise. The marriage became a mechanical coexistence, devoid of passion, connection, or truth. And every time I looked at her, I felt a mixture of guilt and compassion. Guilt for not being able to love her as she deserved. Compassion for seeing her deceived, believing a story that never really existed. The weight of this lie grew stronger in the quiet moments. At night, when the house slept, I would stare at the ceiling and wonder how many men were living the same double life at that very moment. How many were trapped in sham marriages, sustaining the same lie in the name of social acceptance. How many had already wasted decades trying to fit into a mold that was never theirs. And, even more painful, how many would never find the courage to break this cycle. A defining moment occurred at a family dinner. My father-in-law, laughing, commented, "Now that's a real man. He's married, works hard, and takes care of his family." Everyone clapped, everyone smiled. But deep inside me, that comment felt like a life sentence, because I knew I was living a sham. With each compliment, each recognition, the hole grew deeper. It was like being applauded for playing a role in a play I never wanted to be a part of. And here's an important point. Marriage as a facade doesn't just deceive others. It also destroys those who live it. It steals precious years, steals opportunities for happiness, steals the chance to fully experience desire. Over the years, I became increasingly empty. I worked, smiled, attended parties, but inside I was only silent. And silence is a slow poison, slowly corroding until a man becomes a shadow of his former self. Those of you listening know what I'm talking about. Many of you may have done the same. Some may still be married, maintaining a lie to keep up appearances. Others may have gone through it and managed to break free. I want you to participate. Write the word courage in the comments if you believe living a lie is worse than facing rejection. This interaction isn't just for the video. It's a way to show that there's a community of men who know exactly what it's like to carry this weight. Returning to my story, marriage was becoming unbearable. The cold nights, the silent dinners, the excuses to be absent. I began to invent fishing trips, work trips, commitments that never existed, just to find a few minutes of freedom. Not necessarily to live out my desire, but simply to avoid having to pretend. And in those intervals alone, I felt a mixture of relief and despair. Relief at not having to keep up the pretense. Despair at knowing that, even in those moments, I still lacked the courage to be who I truly am. And it was precisely from this routine of lies that the next chapter of my life began to take shape. Because no one can hide the truth forever. Eventually, the body speaks, the mind speaks, the heart speaks. And when the mask begins to slip, the consequences are inevitable. The routine of lying began almost imperceptibly. At first it seemed like a mere detail, a necessary adaptation to keep everything in order, a quick excuse, a forced smile, an absence explained with half-truths. But over time, this habit became a lifestyle. Living in hiding requires discipline. It was as if each day were a performance, and every gesture, every word, needed to be carefully rehearsed to avoid letting anything slip. I no longer woke up as myself. I woke up as the character I had created to survive. A character who knew how to smile, how to hug, how to give ready-made answers, but who, inside, carried an emptiness impossible to fill. Every morning was the same. Coffee on the table, the newspaper open, my wife talking about simple plans for the day, and I responding with short sentences, trying to appear present when, in fact, my mind was elsewhere. Life seemed perfect from the outside, but inside it was just an automatic script. The kiss on the way out, the wave to the neighbors, the work done efficiently. Everything was as expected. But this normality was a huge burden. There was no pleasure, only obligation. There was no desire, only repetition. At night, the scene repeated itself. The television was on, the children were playing, the family dinner was over. The children's laughter was genuine, but mine was rehearsed. My body was there, but my heart remained distant. Each day was another chapter in the farce I had fostered. And the worst part is that as time passed, I began to believe that perhaps this was what life was all about. Fulfilling roles, sustaining images, swallowing desires. The man who once dreamed of true love had become someone who merely survived. And here's the thing. Living this routine of lies is more exhausting than any hard job. Because it's not just about keeping up appearances in front of others, but also lying to yourself every day. The mind never rests. Every word spoken is reviewed before it comes out. Every look is measured. Every gesture is controlled. It's like constantly walking through a minefield, where any oversight could reveal the truth. How many of you have felt this? This feeling of always being on the verge of being discovered? If you have, write the word truth in the comments to share your experience anonymously, but powerfully. Social gatherings were a real torment. At family gatherings, couples exchanged affection. Men talked about their conquests, and I just smiled, pretending I was in on the same game. Someone would always ask, "So happy in your marriage?" And I'd answer without hesitation, "Yes, very happy." A lie repeated so often that it came automatically, almost naturally. But my body always betrayed me. The lost gaze, the shallow breathing, the prolonged silence when I was alone. Desire, of course, never disappeared. On the contrary, it manifested itself in the most unlikely moments. A coworker who smiled differently, a quick encounter on the street, a sudden memory of youth. My heart raced, my body responded, but my mind raced to suppress any sign. I became a master at disguising, at hiding, at turning everything into nothing. But inside, each stifled desire was like a new scar added to the old. The nights were the worst. Lying next to my wife, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how much longer I could endure this. Her body pressed against mine, but there was no warmth. Her touch felt like a cruel reminder of everything that was missing. While she drifted off to sleep peacefully, I fought endless internal battles. Sleep wouldn't come. My mind wandered back to the past, to the first unfulfilled desire, to hidden glances, to lost opportunities. It was as if each night were a solitary prison, where only I knew the truth. And the lie didn't just affect my marital life. At work, the character also existed, the serious, dedicated, trustworthy man. I never let on anything that might raise suspicion. I avoided conversations about relationships, dodged personal questions, and made up stories to fill the gaps. My colleagues believed me and praised my seriousness, but none of them knew the weight I carried. Living in hiding required energy, attention, and constant vigilance. And the more time passed, the more tired I became. What once seemed like a mere survival strategy began to transform into a disease. My body began to show signs: unexplained pain, anxiety, palpitations. I tried to ignore them, but I knew they were consequences of the life I led, because the body never forgets what the soul represses. The daily lies, the forced smiles, the unrealistic hugs, all of this takes a heavy toll. The most painful thing was realizing that, while I hid, life passed me by. The years slipped by like sand slipping through my fingers. My children grew up, my wife grew old, my friends went their separate ways, and I remained in the same place, stuck in a routine that didn't belong to me. It was as if I were only half alive. I lived for others but never for myself. How many of you right now can relate to this feeling of always playing a role? How many have felt like your life is just a performance? If you understand this burden, comment on the word freedom, because only those who have lived the routine of lies know how valuable freedom is. Gradually, the emptiness became unbearable. I no longer felt pleasure in anything, not in small achievements, not in family moments. Everything seemed colorless, lifeless. The routine was just repetition. Wake up, work, smile, dinner, sleep. And in the midst of it all, desire remained trapped, stifled, begging to be heard. This internal tension grew and grew, to the point where it was no longer possible to pretend everything was okay. That's precisely where the story began to take a different turn, because no one can sustain a lifetime of lies without something breaking along the way. And when the mask begins to crack, everything around them is put at risk. Marriage, family, health, sanity. The reunion happened when life seemed tired of repeating the same days. On a cloudy afternoon, half-empty streets, a gentle wind pushing leaves along the ground. My body followed its usual routine, but inside something was preparing without warning. And then, on the other side of the street, a familiar face. My pace slowed, my breath faltered for a second. My heart made a noise of ancient memory. Time passes, but certain eyes span decades as if they'd been waiting on the corner. First came the doubt. Could it really be? Then the shock. It was. My body reacted before reason could. My chest heated. My hands became hesitant. My head tried to feign normalcy. He approached with the same posture as always, now marked by signs of maturity that didn't hide what had always been there. that presence that filled the spaces, that easy laugh that seemed to open windows, that gaze that, in the past, had lit a fire that never truly went out. There was gray hair, wrinkles that told stories but also a familiar glow, an axis of security that reorganized everything within. The first hug was quick, almost formal, and yet something trembled within me. A timid, "Long time no see, how are you?" that tried to disguise the avalanche building behind the words. We talked about what was safe, work, the city, family, the rhythm of the days. But the real dialogue took place beneath what was said, in the silences that stretched, in the light touch that lingered a moment too long, in the glances that darted and returned, as if asking permission without asking. It was an encounter, but it was also a mirror, because there, right in front of me, was the version of myself that had been frozen in the past, waiting for its moment to breathe. We headed to a cafe, almost without planning. The glass door reflected two faces that suddenly seemed to belong to a time all our own. The conversation started out stiff, but soon warmed up. Memories resurfaced like forgotten photographs in drawers. The square, the crumpled uniform, a hot afternoon, a near confession that died before it was even born. The cup hit the table with a dry thud, and it was as if that sound confirmed. What was left behind didn't die. It just learned to wait. The old fear was still there, watchful, but my body refused to obey completely. There was an urge to get closer, to close the distance, to stop pretending. The following days became fertile ground for excuses. "Shall we have lunch near your work? I can show you a new place that opened. I have half an hour before my next meeting." The excuses were polite and discreet, but the real reason was different. To breathe, to sit across from each other and feel life regain its pulse, to walk side by side and feel our steps find their rhythm, to hear that voice and notice that anxiety for a moment was silenced. The world outside demanded a mask, commitment, a script. These encounters, however, opened a crack through which real air could enter. The facade remained standing, but it was shedding a layer each day. Then comes the moment no one plans. In the midst of a simple conversation, words fail me and silence takes over. In the silence, there's a silent question, a restrained request, a courage that decides to emerge. My body leans in without fanfare, my eyes confirm, my hand gently touches the back of his neck, and the kiss happens as if it had been rehearsed for years. It's not long, it's enough, it's urgent, it's serene. It carries the weight of repression and at the same time, the lightness of what finally finds its place. There are no fireworks, no explosion. There's a connection and an immediate understanding. Nothing would be the same after that. Soon after, dizziness sets in. The heart is grateful. The mind screams. Joy ignites everything within, but fear pulls the brakes. What now? The life we've built, the promises, the appearances, the routine, the expectations of others. Everything passes like a fast-forward movie. It's impossible to deny what happened, and at the same time, it's terrifying to admit what it means. But there's a truth we can no longer unsee. What was always stifled has just found its own voice. And when desire breathes, the lie loses its breath. The following encounters attempt to return to safe territory, but it's futile. The coffee tastes different. The street seems a different color. Time flows differently. Touch becomes natural. Laughter comes easily. Pauses cease to be awkward and become spaces of recognition. It's not just his presence that transforms everything. It's the experience of finally existing fully for a few minutes. My body, which spent years obeying the order to silence, quickly learned the way back. The path of truth. A mutual care grew along with courage. I respected his limits. He understood mine. We knew that territory was fragile and precious. No one was there to destroy lives, but to save one that had been postponed. And even without grandiose promises, there was a silent pact between us, not to waste what fate had given us. Not every reunion comes to repeat the past. Some arrive to free the future. Still, the weight of real life didn't disappear. My house remained a home. The dinner table was still set. The questions kept coming. There was a constant play of shadows. On the outside, the paper the world knew. On the inside, a beginning that demanded the right to exist. The conflict wasn't an accident. It was a consequence. When the truth dawns, everything built on fear begins to creak. My body, once exhausted, began to show signs of recovery. Sleep returned some nights. My chest opened. My breathing found a rhythm. But my mind wouldn't stop. What if someone saw? What if someone suspected? What if everything came crashing down? That reunion wasn't just with one person. It was a reunion with my own story. With the teenager who didn't speak. With the adult who grew accustomed to surviving. With the man who learned to call normal what always hurt. Looking into the eyes of the one who once lit the first flame, a question arose within me that changes everything. How long could I live away from myself? It's a simple question, but it shakes foundations. Anyone who has lived decades in disguise mode knows that any spark of truth has the power of an earthquake. On one of our walks, the city seemed complicit. A street emptier, a yellow light on the sidewalks, the sound of mingled footsteps. Hands touched unintentionally and lingered there for seconds that felt like years. There were no speeches, no theatrical declarations. There was only presence, and this presence had an unexpected effect. It diminished the internal noise, organized feelings, dismantled the narrative that it's too late. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it never had been. Maybe what was missing back then hadn't disappeared. It had simply waited. And like all truth, joy came with responsibility. It wasn't about running over anyone nor denying everything I'd experienced. It was about no longer denying myself. My heart understood with an almost cruel clarity. From now on, any choice would have to be more honest than all the previous ones. There was no longer room to go back to sleeping the lie. There were people involved. There were stories. There was pain. And precisely for this reason, the truth needed to be treated as something sacred, not as an excuse, not as an, escape, but as a path. If you've ever experienced something similar, a meeting that reopened closed doors, a hug that gave you breath, a look that said, there's still time, leave a comment below. Reunion. If what touches you most is the feeling of finally existing, write true. If what defines this moment is the courage to look inside and admit what has always been there, comment courage. These words create a bridge between those watching now and those who haven't yet been able to say anything out loud. And if it makes sense, also write down the part of your story that has been waiting until now. Sometimes the first step to freeing an entire life is typing one word. The next step isn't simple, and it doesn't have to be. As my heart starts beating again for what's real, fear makes a noise. And it's from this noise that the urgency to decide what to do about the risk that grows every day, and the fear that tries to keep everything as it is arises. This is where my story continues. When the heart starts beating again for what is real, the world seems to shrink. The streets become narrow, the windows watch. Ordinary conversations take on the weight of an interrogation. My body demands presence, but my head raises alarms everywhere. It's like walking with a glass filled to the brim. Any misstep spills. Any untimely question makes my hand tremble. From this point on, everything becomes a calculation. Time, place, pretext, exit route. It's not about romanticizing the hidden. It's about recognizing that living the truth in the shadows takes its toll on every minute. Meetings, once secretive, become logistics. Days and times are chosen like moving pieces on a board. Messages acquire codes, innocent nicknames, verbless phrases that only the two of us understand. Rules emerge naturally. Never in the same cafe, never twice in a row in the same neighborhood, never stay beyond the agreed time. My heart cries out. It wants to stay. It wants to talk. It wants to exist without a clock. But fear cuts the conversation like sharp scissors. Every decision is punctuated by questions. What if someone sees? What if someone recognizes? What if a photo emerges from where it shouldn't? At home, the air changes density. The plate on the table, the glass of water, the folded tablecloth. Everything seems like potential evidence. My cell phone becomes a dangerous object. Screen face down, sound muted, notifications hidden. The ringtone vibrates and my chest races. A simple message, "Did you get there okay?" becomes an earthquake. The response must be cold, normal, almost disinterested, as if I need to convince an invisible audience. Fear here has many faces: rejection, judgment, loss, violence. But there's also a face I don't readily embrace: the fear of never having the courage to live outside the shadows. My body feels it. Sleeping becomes difficult. Waking becomes a marathon of justifications. My mind races through scenarios. A call answered by someone else, a family, friend unexpectedly entering the same place, someone who sees from afar and decides to warn me. My heart, which has found its voice again, now needs to speak to prudence. And prudence, for someone who has spent years hiding desire, often comes disguised as paranoia. It's a fatigue that doesn't show up in blood tests. It's a tightness in my throat that won't go away with water. It's the exhaustion of sustaining two realities, while I desperately desire only one. There was a near miss. A rainy afternoon, umbrellas leaning against the door, coats hanging on a bench. The conversation heated by the relief of existing mask-free for a few minutes. Suddenly, a shadow on the window, an acquaintance entering and looking for a table. My body reacts before my mind. I create distance with a gesture, change the subject, change my posture, suppress my laughter. The acquaintance recognizes me in passing, waves, sits at the back. Nothing happened, reason says. But my body has already experienced a complete escape in silence. In the following minutes, each word becomes a heavy brick. It's in these moments that fear bares its teeth. It bites without touching. After that, protocols emerge, arriving separately, leaving on different streets, giving warnings when crossing the corner, checking reflections in shop windows like reading signs. It's not pretty. It's not ideal. It's what's possible for those who don't yet have an open road. And yet, even in this choreography of care, there's something alive that no amount of caution can erase. The gesture of reaching out without warning, the laughter that releases the chest, the guiltless silence for a few moments. The paradox hurts. What saves also threatens. What gives air also drowns. Desire demands light. Life demands shade. At home, fissures emerge. A simple question, do you look different? Sets off internal sirens. A change of perfume, an ill-fitting shirt, a 10-minute delay, and my heart has already written 10 versions of an answer before I can even open my mouth. Sometimes there's no question at all, just a gaze that lingers for a moment. Fear, in these moments, creates noises where perhaps there's only wind, but it's also true that when the soul shifts its axis, the body betrays it. The way we walk, a deeper breath after a shower, a lightness that tries to hide. The greatest fear now isn't being discovered by someone. It's discovering myself out loud. At work, the script remains impeccable, but my attention lapses. A colleague comments on fidelity. Another makes a cheap joke. Someone talks about the right life. My laugh is in tune, but it's unconvincing. A meeting that should have lasted 30 minutes turns into 42 because my mind wanders to the park bench from years ago, to that recent cloudy afternoon, to the hand on the back of my neck that rearranged everything. Guilt tries to sit at the table, but my body prevents it. Guilt doesn't erase truth. Guilt only postpones the bridge. Fear, in turn, demands that the bridge be built with concrete, not momentum, and the body continues to take its toll. Sleep is interrupted. Hunger pangs are unrelenting. Headaches come like a tidal wave. One particular morning, my chest tightens in the elevator. It's not a heart attack, it's not an illness, it's a cry for escape. What relaxes me is simple. Sitting on an empty sidewalk, hearing a familiar voice say, "Breathe with me," letting time regain its rhythm. There are hugs that can't happen on the street. There are words that can only be said in dimly lit places. That doesn't make them any less true. And the more true everything becomes, the clearer the question that lingers day and night becomes. How long will it be possible to go on like this? Over time, a harsh and honest understanding emerges. Risk won't disappear. Neither will fear. They aren't a mistake along the way. They're part of it as long as life remains divided. What changes, slowly, is my relationship with both. Fear stops being the master and becomes a counselor. Risk stops being the executioner and becomes a ruler. It measures choices, organizes priorities, demands responsibility. It's no longer possible to pretend nothing is happening. At the same time, it's still impossible to announce to the world a truth that will hurt innocent people. Walking in this environment requires a maturity that sometimes only pain has taught. In the quietest moments, thoughts visit me with alternatives. Talking to someone, neutral. Writing a text that will never be sent. Recording an audio message and deleting it. Rehearsing phrases in front of the mirror. I need to tell you, this isn't about disrespect. It's not against you, it's for me. These aren't excuses. They're attempts to build a bridge that won't collapse with the first step. After decades of hiding my own story, I've learned that there's no ready-made map. There's only the decision and its consequences. There's also a new tenderness that emerges amidst the fear. Small precautions to avoid hurting beyond the inevitable. Short messages that say, "Did you get there okay? Take care. I'm here." The constant reminder that no one got into this to destroy anything. They got into it to save what could still be saved. Amid the tension, an almost ritualistic respect grew. Not using the truth as a weapon, not using fear as an excuse, not using desire as a shortcut to cruelty. Life demands firmness, but it also demands gentleness. And that, now, has become a value for me. Being truthful without being brutal. If you, who are listening to me now, know this contradiction closely, the joy of truly existing for a few minutes and the panic of losing everything the next, write fear in the comments. If what moves you is the next step, write courage. And if this part of the story reminded you that lies have a cost and the truth has a price, let it price. These words help name what many have felt but never said. They also pave the way for what comes next, because it is precisely from here, from this narrow corridor between risk and fear, that the decision that changes destinies is born. And it's coming, even if it doesn't yet have a name. Because when the heart learns to breathe outside the script, life demands a response. You can't live forever on the edge of the abyss. At some point, someone has to choose where to step. The price doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates like dust in the corners of the house, almost invisible at first, until one day everything is covered. Waking up tired was already normal, but now it's a weariness that seems to live in the bones. My body, which learned to survive on little air, begins to take its toll with palpitations, constant heartburn, muscles tense as guitar strings. My head demands silence, but my heart makes noise. And when life is divided between facade and truth, each part begins to suffer. Work loses its charm. Patience with people diminishes. Empathy grows short. It's not a lack of character. It's a lack of oxygen. Living denying desire, identity, one's own voice is living with windows closed from the inside. The light is gone. The price also shows up where it hurts most. In affection. Those at home feel it. The hug that was once formal now seems distant, as if the skin had formed a film that blocks the heat from penetrating. End-of-day conversations become reports. Simple questions, "How was it?" are met with meager answers. Normal, that say nothing and yet consume everything. Touch becomes a chore, a kiss a habit, a look a broken bridge. On the other side of the table is someone who is not to blame for anything, and yet pays the price. They pay in the frustration of not understanding, in the insecurity, in the fear of missing something without knowing what. And this hurts. It hurts both. There's also the price of time. Years under the control of fear leave their mark. Birthdays where the smile was half exposed, trips that looked beautiful in photos but empty in memories, opportunities rejected for not being relevant when in fact they were relevant to me, to who I truly was. How many conversations have I avoided? How many friendships have I not deepened for fear of being seen? How many times has the best of me been kept in a drawer that has never been opened? Time cannot be returned, and that's why it exacts a higher price than all other creditors. When lucidity arrives, it also illuminates what was not experienced, and seeing this requires a strong stomach. Faith, whatever it may be, also comes into play. For me, for a long time, it was both a refuge and a fence. I learned that love came with an asterisk and that dignity had rules that excluded exactly who I was. I tried to negotiate with heaven. I do everything right, just don't ask me to be whole. This bargain exacts high interest. At some point, either guilt grows to the point of paralysis, or spirituality needs to be rebuilt without the voice of shame. And rebuilding takes work. It's relearning to speak to what is sacred without apologizing for existing. Money, curiously, also entered the balance sheet. Dinners to erase guilt, gifts bought to bridge the silence, trips planned to salvage what wasn't on the itinerary. Therapies started and abandoned for fear of saying the right thing out loud. Overtime at work to avoid going home too early. None of this was luxury. It was an attempt to fix on the outside, something that was broken on the inside. But internal leaks can't be fixed with paint and molding. The price then is illusion. There's also the cost to self-image. Years of looking in the mirror as if inspecting flaws, not recognizing a face. My body became an adversary. It gained weight, lost sleep, lost hunger, and asked for help in any way it knew how. Some days, everything turned into irritation, and those around me felt the same. Other days, apathy set in, and everything passed without leaving a mark. What should have been the center, pulsing, loving, belonging, became the periphery, and no one can feel alive being an extra in their own movie. Friends began to notice the cracks. Someone would call about a casual hangout, and my response would be, sometime. That sometime never arrived. Someone else would ask how I was, and I'd say playing. Moving on is often the polite way of saying life isn't touching you anymore. The price here is the loneliness that grows even with a busy schedule. It's being surrounded and still feeling like no one saw the part that matters. And that part, to be seen, needs to be spoken. There's a point where silence stops protecting and starts stealing. In the body, the toll stretches. Digestion worsens. The heart races at the slightest sign of discovery. Breathing becomes shallow. Sleep is interrupted. Living in alert mode disrupts everything. Hormones, mood, memory. Small lapses become common. The key that disappears, the name that slips, the date that slips. My brain, busy keeping watch, has little room to create. And without creation, life becomes smaller. That simple joy, a song that takes me far away, a book that touches me, a conversation that changes me, passes me by, because my mind is too busy trying to survive the day itself. The most silent price was hurting those who shouldn't have to bleed, not out of malice, but through omission. Those who shared my home sensed the distance, tried to get closer, tried to fight for what they understood as love. On my side, there was affection, respect, memory, but romantic love is born of shared truth, and that was missing from the beginning. Is that cruel to say? Perhaps. But crueler is keeping everyone trapped in a story that can only be sustained by sacrifice on one side. The emotional cost of continuing so as not to hurt ends up being greater than facing the necessary pain of change. There are also unseen losses. The faded humor, the vanished curiosity, the waning willingness to learn new things. The world shrinks when the soul must fit into an edited version of itself. I went to the same market, crossed the same street, sat on the same couch, repeated the same conversations. Inside, a silent plea. Give me back the right to surprise myself with myself. This wasn't a whim. It was health. People who can't be whole break down slowly, and there's no denying the anger. It flared like a spark. At myself, for having delayed. At others, for not noticing. At the weather, for not being generous. Anger is dangerous when it becomes ammunition against those who are not to blame, but it's useful when it becomes energy to break out of inertia. Channeled, it pushes. Misused, it destroys. Recognizing this movement was part of the price and part of the learning. Looking back was both painful and instructive. It showed that many of my choices were made under invisible duress. The obligation to live up to expectations, the pressure to maintain my surname and my role, the fear of losing, my seat at the table. Seeing this without torturing myself is a daily exercise, because self-criticism, when it becomes a whip, only repeats the world's violence with a different hand. What breaks the cycle isn't endless guilt. It's responsibility with a beginning, a middle, and action, admitting, communicating, deciding. And it was at this point that the price paid for denial exacted its final toll, one that can't be calculated in invoices, the cost of continuing without change. The question was simple and immense. Is it worth going on like this for another 5 years? For another 10? When you add a number, the illusion loses its luster. Suddenly, the "I'll see later" reveals the bill for "I never saw." And when this picture emerges in its entirety, the inner wall trembles. The old support, fear, facade, silence, can no longer bear the weight of what the truth has conquered within. If you've come this far and recognized parts of this price within yourself, in your tired body, in your lack of warmth in the time that slips away, in your faith that needs rebuilding, in your self-image that needs rescuing, leave a word in the comments that describes you now. It could be price if the account was clear. It may be time if what hurt the most was what didn't come back. It could be true if you felt that despite everything, there's still a bright path inside. Writing this may seem small, but it's the gesture of someone who decides to stop paying with their own life. From then on, there was no longer any way to pretend the cost was cheap. My heart had already learned a new rhythm, and it wouldn't unlearn it. And it was in this new beat, still timid and stubborn, that the next movement began to prepare itself. When the entire invoice was on the table, the click wasn't optional. It was inevitable. Something inside me said enough, and when it did, it summoned what would come next. The bill was on the table, invisible but heavy, and I could no longer pretend it didn't exist. My heart had learned a different rhythm, and once you know the music of truth, it's impossible to go back to dancing to the beat of lies. But the problem was that this music echoed silently, hidden behind the walls of routine, demanding entry with every beat of my chest. The risk was more alive than ever, and fear tried to impose rules. Only now there was something new: urgency. Time was no longer a detail you could postpone. It had become a harsh judge, demanding choices that could no longer be postponed. It was on a seemingly ordinary night that the crack widened. The dinner table was set. Words flowed as usual, but the gaze wouldn't hold. While my family talked about weekend plans, my mind saw another scene. Footsteps sharing the same sidewalk, hands touching without asking permission, a silence charged with presence. My mouth said yes and of course, but my heart was miles away. Suddenly she asked, "Are you here?" The phrase was simple, but it hit like an arrow. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't suspicion. It was simply the acknowledgement of someone who realized that the body was present but the soul was not. And my answer came quickly. "I am, of course." A short lie, which weighed like a sentence. That night, lying in bed, sleep eluded me. The body beside me seemed increasingly distant, and the ceiling seemed like a mirror showing the life I was dragging along. The kiss that had happened days ago burned in my memory. The touch still pulsed on my skin. It was impossible to deny that something had been awakened. But along with this flame came a brutal awareness. Any wrong move could destroy not only my life, but also the lives of those around me. It was the height of paradox, wanting to truly live, yet fearing to kill what had already been alive for years. My chest pounded to the rhythm of a drum, a mixture of anxiety, guilt, and desire. The following encounters became even more intense. Every look carried the weight of a confession. Every touch brought the feeling that the world could end at any second. It was impossible not to sense that something grand was about to happen, and at the same time, impossible to ignore that this something could come with the force of an earthquake. It was raw emotion, joy and fear dancing together, pleasure and dread sharing the same space. My heart was grateful, but my mind continued to write lists of risks. What if someone saw? What if someone found out? What if everything collapsed? It was at this point that my body began to show clearer signs. My chest tightened at unlikely times, my breath faltered during mundane meetings, and anxiety exploded in small everyday situations. Fear was taking its toll, but there was also another, even stronger toll, that of my soul. The old emptiness, the one that had set in way back in my youth, now no longer accepted being fed with excuses. It was as if life was saying, either you choose, or I choose for you. And choosing, that was the hardest part. The weight of the decision began to weigh on everything. At work, tasks seemed mechanical, as if nothing mattered anymore. At home, family conversations became long walls of echo. Each word bounced back and forth meaninglessly. Only in secret meetings was there real life. But living like this was unbearable. The contrast was too cruel. And that's when my heart began to demand a clear answer. How long could I hide? How long would fear rule? How long would my desire be condemned to exist only in fragments? How many of you have felt that edge of the abyss? That feeling that one wrong step can bring everything down, but standing still means dying inside? How many of you have carried that contradiction? If you understand what I'm saying, write abyss in the comments, because this is where many men live, between the risk of falling and the risk of never leaving the same point. And it was precisely at this brink that something unexpected happened. During one of the meetings, after long minutes of silence, a question no one had dared to ask aloud came up. How long are we going to go on like this? The phrase hung in the air, heavier than any statement. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't pressure. It was simply the need to name what we both already knew. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of truth knocking on the door. And when truth knocks, you can't ignore it for long. Your body wouldn't let you anymore. Your mind couldn't handle it anymore. Your heart couldn't take it anymore. This was the moment my story reached its most tense point. The risk of discovery loomed around every corner. Fear loomed like a shadow. But there was also something that had never been stronger. The courage to admit there was no turning back. The climax wasn't just the kiss that happened, nor the reunion. The climax was realizing that, for the first time in decades, I had before me the possibility of choosing myself. And this possibility was as frightening as it was liberating. If you've made it this far, I want you to join me. Write climax in the comments if you too have ever felt that your life was reaching that turning point, where everything could change. Write courage if you believe that the only way to not die inside is to face your own truth. And write life if you feel that deep down, the only thing that truly matters is existing whole, without masks. This interaction is important because it shows that no one is alone. There are other men experiencing the same breaking point. And it was precisely from this point of maximum pressure, that the story continued. Because a decision had to be made, and when it was made, nothing was the same again. The question hung in the air: how long will we go on like this? It wasn't just a phrase. It was an ultimatum from life. Those words carried the weight of a sentence that couldn't be ignored. After that, our encounters no longer held the same lightness. It was no longer possible to pretend it was just a hidden detail. Every gesture carried the awareness that something needed to be done, and that whatever the choice, someone would be hurt. My heart beat in two directions. On one side, the courage to finally truly exist. On the other, the fear of destroying everything around me. It was as if two worlds were fighting for the same body, and one of them would have to give way. The nights became unbearable. The shared bed felt like a trench. The body lying beside it, once a promise of a future, was now just a memory of a life, built in silence. The pillow held unanswered questions. Is it worth continuing to deceive? Is it worth dragging everyone into a lie that no longer holds water? The weight of guilt was so great that sleep disappeared. The early mornings turned into long conversations with fear itself. And fear always said the same thing: if you speak, you'll lose everything. But desire followed right after, retorting, if you don't speak, you've already lost. It was in this struggle that the decision began to take shape. It didn't come as an explosion, it came as a trickle, a nagging discomfort that wouldn't go away, a knot that wouldn't untie, a whisper that repeated itself every day. And the more time passed, the clearer it became. Living divided was no longer possible. My body, my mind, my heart, they all asked for one thing: true. The problem is that truth cannot be announced without consequences, and facing it required a level of courage that, until then, seemed unattainable. One specific moment accelerated everything. It was during a family gathering, the kind where everyone sits around the table and laughs loudly over trivial matters. Someone, between jokes, blurted out, "Now that's a real man, married, hard-working, family man." Applause followed, approving glances, and a toast was raised. And inside, I felt suffocated. It was like being applauded for a play I never wanted to act in. My heart pounded, sweat ran down my back, and the wine glass trembled in my hand. For the first time, the lie seemed unbearable even in front of everyone. The mask began to crack from the inside out. After that day, there was no turning back. The face in the mirror became an enemy. Every morning was a struggle to dress as the person others expected. Every smile I gave at work was an effort not to fall apart right there and then. Secret meetings remained my only escape, but even they had changed. There was no longer room for just feeling. Now there were whispered plans, questions about the future, serious conversations about what might happen. The silence that once sufficed now hurt. The kiss that once healed now took its toll. The hug that once was an escape now demanded permanence. The decision was getting closer, but fear still clung to it. What if my family never spoke to me again? What if my children rejected me? What if I ended up alone? These questions repeated themselves in a loop, like a sentence rewritten every day. But there was also another, even stronger question. And if I stay here, how many pieces of me will still be left in 10 years? That question cut like a knife because it wasn't just about losing external things. It was about losing myself, and there was nothing more painful than that thought. It was then that the climax truly arrived. The risk was real. The fear was real. but so was the need to break free. My heart had already tasted freedom, and there was no going back. Life was demanding a gesture, a cut, a confession. It didn't matter if it would be gentle or brutal, it mattered only that it was true, and silence for the first time in decades seemed the cruelest option of all. One night, sitting alone in the living room, looking at the family photos on the bookshelf, the realization hit. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a freak-out, it was a simple, devastating realization. Either I choose to live now, or I will die slowly, until the end. The decision, in that instant, stopped being about desire. It became about survival, about giving myself the right to exist fully, without masks, without excuses. The fear was still there, big, strong, but it no longer ruled alone. Courage, even though trembling, began to take the lead. How many of you have felt that turning point, that moment when there is no escape, when the only way out is to face what hurts? If you have, write it down. Decision in the comments. If what moved you most was the feeling of suffocation, write prison. If what weighs most is the hope of freedom, write life. This interaction is essential because it shows that we're not talking about an isolated case. We're talking about an experience that spans generations, that shapes lives, that marks destinies. The approaching decision wasn't just personal, it was collective, because when a man finally chooses to truly exist, he doesn't just shatter his own mask, he also shatters the mirror in which so many others still see themselves. And that's why this story needs to be told to its end, because what comes next isn't just a choice, it's a consequence. It's the impact of decades of silence finding for the first time the sound of one's own voice. And that's exactly where my story continued, because the decision was already living within me, but it hadn't yet been announced. And when I said it out loud, I knew the world around me would tremble. The decision lived in my chest, but I lacked a voice. The following days felt like movie sets after the set empties. Objects in place, people in their roles, lines memorized, and a thick silence filling everything. My body, tired of pretending, gasped for air. My heart beat differently, as if it had discovered a new door and refused to return to the narrow corridor. My mind still tried to negotiate. A little more. Tomorrow. Not now. But not now had already become an entire life. One random afternoon, a test of courage came. While rummaging through a drawer, I found old photos. The square, the uniform, the hands almost touching. The youth that remained in a nameless place. It didn't hurt like before. It hurt differently. Like someone who hears their own voice on an old tape and recognizes themselves. My heart understood that it wasn't a whim, it wasn't an adventure, it wasn't a fad. It was identity. It was the need to stop calling survival what deep down was erasure. And when the truth is recognized, it becomes urgent. The house felt it first. A dinner that wouldn't go down, a smile that wouldn't return, a simple question that went unanswered. Are you okay? Wasn't protocol, it was a request. My mouth tried to escape with half words, but my body couldn't keep up. My throat tightened, my eyes heavy, and my hand, on the table, trembled like someone holding a cup about to fall. In my head, a whirlwind, fear of rejection, of loss, of loneliness. But there was a greater fear now screaming, the fear of continuing for years to come to betray my own strength. The night that came didn't ask for permission. The rain beat against the windows, the house dark, the hallway long, the living room lights half-lit, the sofa, the photos, the picture frames, frozen scenes of a proper existence. And yet, an absence haunted each frame. My steps were slow toward the table. On the other side, the eyes that had followed so many birthdays, so many paid bills, so many silences. There was no speech. There was no room. Only what was unavoidable fit. The air grew thick. And then, finally, the voice came. Low, clear, unadorned. I need to tell you who I am. The sentence landed in the room like a heavy object finally hitting the ground. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a thesis. It was a beginning. On the other side, the face closed, opened, seeking support on the back of the chair. Time stretched, and the body, which for years had held a dam, let the water flow. It wasn't a scream. It was an outpouring. The words that had never found a way came. I tried to fit in. I tried to be what was expected of me. I tried to be this, whole, but I can't. I'm a man who loves men, and it's not against you, it's for me, it's for my truth. The sound of my own voice saying I am changed my breathing. It was heavy, it hurt, but it shifted something back into place. The impact came, inevitable, human. Cutting questions, memories tugged like a rope, accusations pierced by pain. Since when? With whom? Why? Wasn't I enough? No answers can instantly mend a wounded heart. What existed was respect for the abyss that had opened there. It was holding back the impulse to justify, to placate, to over-explain. At times I could only repeat what was true. It's not your fault. I was also a victim of this silence. I followed a script that I thought was the only one. I got lost in it, and I don't want to get lost anymore. The night progressed in fits and starts. There were slamming doors, lingering silences, glasses of water that no one drank. But there was also something unprecedented. The end of the theater. The mask fell, and the face, though swollen and red, was still a face. It hurt. It hurt a lot. Still I breathed. It was the first full breath in decades, and in that new air lay an unspoken agreement to weather the storm with as much dignity as possible. The next day, the world didn't improve. It just became real. The phone weighed heavily. The messages were labyrinthine. Work seemed distant. The body moved as if accustomed to carrying a weight in its hand, but another weight had been lifted from its shoulders. The mirror. Returned tired eyes, yes, but it returned someone recognizable. The shower took longer, the coffee tasted alive, and for the first time the word freedom, it didn't sound like an escape. It sounded like responsibility. When the news spread through the house, reactions varied. Some frowned, some looked for someone to blame, some remained silent, unsure of what to say, and there was that inevitable question. What about the children? The answer isn't formulaic. Every story is a delicate matter. That day was one of small steps. Short conversations and sentences measured to the centimeter. Not everything fit, just enough to avoid lying. I had to be careful not to dump on their laps what hadn't yet taken shape within my own chest. I had to make the simple promise to keep talking as long as possible without disappearing. The reunion with the one who lit the light came later, without secret, but still protected. It wasn't a celebration. It was an embrace from someone who understands that love now includes patience and healing. The touch didn't apologize for existing. The city seemed the same and yet different. Walking hand in hand was a rehearsal for the future. The fear still existed. The streets can be cruel, but the shame didn't. The shame had been returned to the place it should never have left. Other people's trash cans. My identity, finally, had an owner. Practical life began to demand documents, addresses, bills, agreements. No one prepares to reorganize a house that seemed right. The ground for a time was left without a map. At the same time, small beacons appeared. A friend who texted, "I'm here," an old song that now had different lyrics. A late afternoon walk that didn't end in a heavy feeling on the back of the neck. Truth isn't anesthesia. It's a compass. It hurts and guides at the same time. Faith, which had been suspended, needed to be renegotiated. Not with dogma, but with what is most intimate. To speak to the sacred without apologizing for who I am. To pray without hiding my desire. To ask for protection, not to return to being someone I wasn't, but to have the courage to remain who I was. To discover that spirituality isn't a fence. It's an open field. And that love, to deserve that name, doesn't come with a footnote that excludes. There were relapses of fear. At the grocery store, a sidelong glance. On the street, a cutting comment. At work, an old joke disguised as a joke. At those times, the urge was to shrink. But something new imposed itself. The decision no longer fit back into the box. Not after hearing my own voice saying, "I am." The word pride, she started out shy, with her hands in her pockets, and learned day by day to straighten her spine. It wasn't about a flag in the window, although it could have been. It was about not asking for forgiveness for existing. If you're listening to me now and felt something stirring inside you, a discomfort, a relief, a fear, a desire, I want to invite you to write a word in the comments. Write true if you understood that remaining silent hurts more than facing whatever comes. Write freedom if breathing asked for space. Write courage if you know that the next step depends first on you. And if you prefer, just write. Sometimes the first gesture of change is to sign one's presence. From now on, everything is still a road. There's paperwork. There are difficult conversations. There are sleepless nights. There's also a different dawn, one in which the body awakens without the weight of fantasy. The world will continue to demand explanations. Life won't. Life asks only one thing, that you be whole when it arrives. And it is arriving, even when it seems not. Because once the door opens from the inside, no one can lock it from the outside. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to you in some way. So don't leave without leaving your mark. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next videos. Each of them can open up new reflections on your life. If this narrative touched you, leave your like. It helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. And I want you to comment below on a simple but powerful word. True. This is the sign that you followed until the end and believe that no one deserves to live in hiding. And it doesn't end here. Click on the next video that's appearing on the screen. The journey continues, and I'm sure you'll recognize yourself even more in what lies ahead.